represent the church, a church that will face martyrdom and persecution. For example, in verse 4 here, where it says that these two witnesses, one of them, we have here that there's two pictures that are symbolic here. One is a picture of the olive trees. And that reminds us that in Zechariah chapter 4, he had a vision of a big bowl. And on either side of the bowl, there were two olive trees. And from these two olive trees, there's these pipes pouring into the bowl. In other words, the oil from the olive trees was coming into the bowl. And when Zechariah asked the Lord, what does this mean? It says, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, not by might, nor my power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. And it seems here that the two olive trees are symbolic of the Jewish believers who are filled with the Spirit. And then the two lampstands. We're reminded back in the beginning of the book of Revelation that each of the 7 churches was seen symbolically as a lampstand. And so we have two lampstands here that stand for the rest of the church. So we have here these two symbolic pictures that stand for the church that's going to go through, or has been and will be, going through times of persecution. But we see that these two witnesses also move in the power of God. They have the ability to shut up the sky so there won't rain, and they have the ability to call down plagues. Now, who does that remind you of? It reminds you of Elijah, who shut up the heavens, and it reminds you of Moses, who brought down the 10 plagues in Egypt. And these two figures are kind of merged into one, and God's saying here that my church needs to be a church that moves in the power of God with signs and wonders to impact our world with the gospel. Now we see here that there will be times also when the beast comes up from the abyss and attacks the church. And that's happened in history. It's going to happen in the future. That the beast, which stands for evil empires, comes up and attacks the church. And through history, we've found that, if you know anything about church history, that there are times in the past where churches have been attacked and they've died. You can see it all through North Africa. A lot of the churches died through history. In other areas of the world, the early church, when they were under persecution from the Roman Caesars and the Roman Empire, they were afraid that they're going to die because of the attack of the abyss, the beast from the abyss. When the Chinese government, the communist government, took over China in 1949, they estimate there were about 3 million Christians in China, about 1 million Protestants and a couple of million Catholics in China back in 1949. And all the missionaries were expelled, and the communists set out to destroy the church. And then the bamboo curtain, we called it, came down. And for at least 2 or 3 decades, nobody knew what happened in China. You hear little whispers, but we really didn't have a clue what was going on. And a lot of people felt that in actual fact, during that period of time, the church could have actually been wiped out by the communists. But in the 1980s, when the bamboo curtain lifted, what do we discover? We discover instead that God had moved with such life and power in His church that He raised the church up, and by the end of the 1990s, even the communist government themselves were admitting that there were at least 63 million Christians in China. And so within that period of time of about 40 years, the church hadn't died. I mean, it pretty much did it initially, but then God just raised it to life, as it were, and boom, it exploded into life. And you get figures now from sort of 80 to 100 million plus Chinese are Christians and are on fire for Jesus. In North Korea, the Christians in North Korea have probably experienced the most brutal and persistent persecution than probably any other country in the world, in our modern world. And just a few years ago, People were saying, well, we don't think there's any Christians left in North Korea. Well, now we actually know that there are Christians left in North Korea. In fact, they say there's quite a lot of Christians in North Korea, but they suffer something terribly under the North Korean Communist government. They say at any one time, 10% of the Christians in North Korea are in labour camps, and most of them never come out of those labour camps. They die there. They're treated so terribly for their faith. And so through history we see that there are times where the church has died. And yet God comes along and he resurrects churches as well. One of the exciting stories right now is in Morocco, in North Africa, where amongst the Berber people there's this amazing growth of people who are just coming to the Lord. These people who had been Muslims, and there's this amazing kind of stories coming out of Morocco of people coming to the Lord and finding Jesus. It's like God's stepping back and stepping into the situation, and he's raising the church up and breathing life into it together again. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 5. Oh, actually, someone gave me a book to read. The Vicar of Baghdad. Anybody read the book? It's a great book. This British Anglican priest who goes to minister to this church that had nobody in it. It was this big church that had been emptied out. And that was his church. He was to go and minister to this church. He's now got, I don't know how many, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I mean, I think in his book he talks about 1,800 people, and that was back a few years. They just kept on coming and coming and coming into this church. And he just makes the interesting comment, and we don't think about this, but in Iraq, the church has been there since New Testament times. And he makes the comment that the Muslims think that the Christians are foreigners. He actually makes the comment the Christians were there a long time before the Muslims were. And he makes the comment that in his congregation, it's now almost all children and women, because so many of the men have been killed, assassinated, or they've had to flee the country. And he's just got hundreds and hundreds of kids come to his church, and they come right in the midst of all this carnage that has been. This is going back a couple of years now, but right in the midst of all the carnage, God was doing something amazing in this church, where people just couldn't stop but come, even when they knew that all his bullets were flying around, and he would be escorted by all these Iraqi police and all the rest of it to even get to the church, and all these people would be there in their hundreds, because God was there. And I just thought, what a wonderful thing, in the midst of all this carnage and suffering and people dying, God was in that place in an amazing kind of way. He said there were times when they couldn't actually meet in their church. They used to meet in Saddam Hussein's palace. And he's got a picture of himself sitting in Saddam Hussein's gold-plated chair. and the government gave him this building to meet as a church to worship him. I just thought, wonderful, isn't it? When God begins to work and move by his Spirit, he can do amazing things. And when churches die and people suffer and people just cry out to God again, God can come with his resurrection power and raise his church up. Now, the danger that we face in New Zealand is not persecution and suffering. The danger that we face is that we can become so comfortable with our Christianity, so comfortable that we actually keep our mouths shut and don't say anything about our faith, because we might feel uncomfortable if they reject what we're sharing with them. And I think that's a real problem for us. It's a real problem for me. I don't like offending people. I like to be liked. And because we're comfortable, we actually don't like to feel that we're getting off sides with people. So what do? We keep our mouth shut, to the point even that some of you in your workplaces, your mates around you, don't even know that you're a Christian. I think that's a real indictment on us. Jesus has said he's a faithful witness. We also need to be people who are faithful witnesses. And I want to challenge you this morning. I want to challenge you to be thinking more about your witnessing. You know, we all recognise that it's vital that